Okay, guys, so today we're talking about finding slope. And this should be a review. This should be familiar from what you learned in eighth grade. How to find slope using the formula. So notice right here on our paper, we have the formula for slope. Okay. We remember that slope is represented by the letter M. And then y2 and y1 are our y values of our ordered pair. X2 and x1 are just simply the x values in the ordered pair. So we need to remember that ordered pairs are given to us as x, comma, y. Okay? So in order to find our slope, m, we want to subtract on top the y values. On the bottom, we want to subtract our x values. Now, you may have learned that you have to subtract the second y value from the first y value. But it doesn't really matter. The truth is you can subtract them in any order you want. So long as when you come to the bottom, if you subtract, let's say we pick this y value to subtract first. So let's say we're going to say 2, and then we're going to subtract. That subtraction symbol is part of the formula, as you can see up here. We're going to subtract this y value. So I'm going to say 2 subtract this y value, which is -6. So now when we come down to the bottom to subtract our x values on the bottom, since I started with this 2, I need to start with this y value, this x value. So I'm going to say this x value 3 subtract this x value -4. So you see, it's not actually going to matter which one you do first, and I'll prove it to you by doing it both ways. So for our numerator now, in the top of our fraction, our slope fraction, we have 2 subtract a -6, which becomes +8. And you can use your calculator for that. And then the denominator, when we subtract our x values, we have 3 subtract -4, which that becomes a +7. So our slope is 8/7. Now, let's say just for fun, let's do it the other way around. So remember, these subtraction symbols are part of the formula, so they need to stay there. So I'm going to subtract my x values, but I'm going to start with the second x value this time. I'm going to say -6 subtract this y value 2. I think I said x values, I meant y values. I'm going to say -6 y value subtract this y value. And in the denominator, I'm going to say the second x value subtract the first x value. So what I end up with is -6 minus 2, which is -8. In the denominator, I have -4 minus 3, which is -7. But we need to remember that a negative divided by a negative is actually positive. So we end up with +8/7, which, as you notice, is the same. So it doesn't matter which value you choose first, if you use the first y value or the second y value. So long as when you go to subtract the x values on the bottom, you use its partner of the one that you started with. So this is how we find slope from 2 ordered pairs using the slope formula. Now let's say I want to find the slope if I am given a table of values and I want to find the slope. Well, again, I'm going to use the same formula that's given to me up here. And I need to subtract my y values in the numerator, the top of the fraction, and subtract the x values in the denominator, or the bottom of the fraction. So we have to think about it. Well, how many points do we actually need to find slope? Well, we only need 2. So I'm going to choose 2 rows of this table to use. And it doesn't matter which rows you want. You can choose any that you want. So I'm going to choose this row, and I'm going to choose this row. So we need to remember that f of x, another name for f of x, is just y. So these really are x and y values. I could think of these as ordered pairs. Ordered pair -3, 5, and the ordered pair 0, 10. So I've chosen my 2 rows of my table that I want to use. So I'm going to circle my y values in one color And then I'm going to come back, and now I'm going to circle my x values in another color. So I need to subtract my y values in the numerator of my fraction. I need to subtract the x values in the denominator of the fraction. Because slope is change in y's, the difference in the y's, over the difference in the x's. So let's do that. And again, it doesn't matter which way I start. If I do 5 minus 10 or 10 minus 5, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to say 5. I'll do that in purple. 5, subtract 10. In the denominator, I'm going to say, since I started with a 5, I have to start with this negative 3. Negative 3, subtract 0. And now I'm left with 5 minus 10 is negative 5. Negative 3 minus 0 is negative 3. And again, a negative divided by a negative becomes a positive. So my slope is positive 5/3. So let's say I'm given a graph and I want to find the slope from a graph. Well, if you notice on this graph, I have 2 points that are labeled for me, or I could find 2 other points. Again, we need 2 points to find the slope from a graph. We always need 2 points if we're going to find slope using the formula, or if we use rise over run. So you may remember you can do slope equals, so I'm going to write this down here, and it equals rise over run. So for this example, I'm going to pick 2 points. Now this is a point here for me, or I could use this point. It looks like a good point. And I see another point here. So it doesn't matter. Just pick 2 points. So I'm going to choose this point here and this point here. Now this is a special point right here. This is where our line is crossing the y-axis. We call that point the y-intercept. And this point over here is also a special point because it's where our line is crossing the x-axis. We call that an x-intercept. Or another word for that is a 0. 0 is a new vocabulary word, but it means the same thing as an x-intercept. Because they call it a 0 because the y value there is 0. So I'm going to calculate my rise over my run. So I know I need to rise up and then I need to run. So I'm going to pay attention to the scaling on the y-axis. If I count from the origin, I see this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so I know that my y-axis is scaled by 1. So I can rise up 1, 2, 3, 4. And when I go to run, I need to pay attention to the scaling on the x-axis. This is a very common mistake with students. They don't pay attention to the scaling. And so they'll end up counting 1, 2, 3. But if we look, the x-axis is actually counting by 2s. So we actually have to count 2, 4, 6. So now we just need to simplify our fraction. So 4/6 can be simplified as 2/3 because 4 divided by 2 is 2 and 6 divided by 2 is 3. So my slope from this graph is 2/3. And it is a positive slope. I can look. So I have to pay attention to when I'm rising and running from a graph because if my slope is negative, I need to make sure that the number I find reflects that. But we can tell this is an increasing line from left to right. It's going up. So it is indeed a positive slope. Okay, so if we have an equation such as this, we can look at the equation if it's in the form y equals mx plus b. And notice that m stands for slope. Well, the m, if your equation is solved for y, if y is all by itself, there's nothing around it on this side of the equation, then you can just look and see what number is in front of m, and that will be your slope. So looking at number 1, we see that indeed y is by itself on this side. There is nothing else around y. So we can look at the x. We can see what value is in front of x. So our slope must be 3 for this equation because y is all by itself. This equation is solved for y. It is in the form y equals mx. M is in front of x, 3x plus b. And b would be 2 in this instance. And we need to remember that m is slope and b is the y-intercept. So then look at number 2. We can look and see that on this side of the equation there is y, but it's multiplied by 4, and this 3x term is on this side as well. So this equation is not in the form y equals mx plus b. So I cannot just look in front of x and say that my slope of this equation is 3. That's not true. It's not in the form y equals mx plus b. So I'm actually going to have to solve this one for y. So I look over at this term. I want y to be by itself so that I can rearrange it into the form y equals mx plus b. So I have this 3x term. So I need to move this 3x term to the other side of the equation. So I draw my line and I look at the 3x term and I see that it's positive. So I know that if I subtract 3x from both sides, well, it will cancel out on this side because positive 3x plus a negative 3x makes 0. And the only thing left over here is negative 4y. Now I look at 12 and 3x and negative 3x, and I can see those are not like terms. So I cannot combine those together. So when I have two terms on a side that I'm subtracting or adding and I can't combine them, you just end up writing it down. So just write both terms down. This is just an expression that is not like terms, so I can't combine those terms. So now I look back over here. I want y by itself. So I say, well, negative 4 is multiplied times y. And the opposite of that is division. So if I divide by negative 4 on this side, it will cancel out and I'm just left with y. But this is an equation. So whatever I do to one side, I must do to both sides. So I have to also divide this side by 4, by negative 4. Okay, so this is not quite in the form y equals mx plus b. I have one more step, and I have to know this rule, that when I have two terms divided by one number, I can break this apart as long as I divide each individual piece by negative 4. So all I'm doing is breaking this into two fractions. This is a legal move in math. We can take two pieces that are divided by one piece in the denominator, and we can break it apart by just dividing each piece by that number. So now I'm just left to simplify. Well, 12 divided by negative 4 is negative 3. You can use your calculator for that. Then I see I have a negative divided by a negative, which becomes a positive. And this is actually 3 over 4. And I don't want to change this to a decimal because I remember that slope is usually a fraction. And then the x that's sitting in the top, the numerator, can slide down to the side. That's legal. You can't move him down to the bottom. That would change the exponent on x. But it can just slide over and sit next to it, the fraction on the side. So now this is in the form y equals m in front of x plus a b value. So our b value is actually negative 3, but I'm more interested in what is my slope. So I look and see what is sitting in front of x, and it is positive 3/4. So my slope must be 3/4.